This graph describes how morals function at a fundamental level in combination with how the output value of our actions affect your perception of them. Notice that the actual morality of your actions is entirely determined by your intentions and has nothing to do with whether or not your actions are helpful or damaging. The productivity or damage of one's actions only determines its perceived value to others. Unfortunately, humans tend to care much less about the morality of an action and much more about whether or not your actions prioritize their desires. That's why it's important to distinguish morality from value. The color gradient in this chart represents how we tend to positively or negatively judge people based on both the perceived intentions and outcomes of their actions. Notice the blue side is smaller than the opposite red side. As the saying goes, narrow is the path of righteousness, and humans are much more reactive to loss than gain. For the structure of this video, I'll first address a few potential criticisms of the graph, then I'll discuss the graph's beneficial and potentially disturbing implications, and then I'll break down its components and sectors. If your initial reaction is to disagree with this chart, take a moment to think about how you make moral decisions in circumstances when your moral system does not provide you with a perfect answer for dealing with unique problems. When you're forced to make judgment decisions that your strict moral laws don't provide perfectly designed solutions for, I think you'll find that you tend to view the morality and value of your actions similarly to the concepts of this chart. If your issue with this chart is that the color gradient and morality should be almost entirely or just mostly determined by the positive or negative output of your actions, regardless of intent, then there's a good chance you have a problem with empathy. There's might be other words for that, but that's not what this video is for. Now, if you just slightly disagree with the way I've distributed the colors, I understand. I did all of this in PowerPoint, so my ability to customize the color overlay was limited. If I had Photoshop and was good with it, I would have adjusted the yellow, gray, and green zones a little bit more. What are the implications of this graph in relation to how we judge others, ourselves, and various behaviors? On the positive side, you have no reason to feel guilty about failures that occurred when you were giving your best effort. Lots of abused people and former military leaders live with survivor's guilt because of unfortunate decisions they made under pressure. It doesn't matter if you could have done better if you had more information, or if you had more resources, or if you could have calmed yourself to think more clearly. In those moments, you were not able to. And the only thing that matters is whether or not you were dedicated to achieving the best outcome you knew how to achieve. Another implication is that when accidents occur and no one is either acting with neglect or selfish intent, no one is to blame regardless of how badly anyone is harmed. It doesn't matter if you couldn't hit the brakes fast enough when you got in that accident. It doesn't matter if you theoretically could have done more if your conditions were slightly different. It doesn't matter how severe the consequences of your actions were. What matters is the extent to which you knew that your actions were negligent, selfish, and/or malicious. Obviously, society can't always afford to issue light punishments when severe accidents occur as a result of minor negligence, because then all criminals would just try to claim that their failures or violations were just accidents. But you don't have to hold yourself accountable to the same extent that others do. And there will also be times when you may need to hold yourself more accountable than others will, depending on how minimal your consequences are. What are the potentially more disturbing realities implied by this graph? Ignorant, destructive people should not always be viewed as malicious enemies. Actually, many of them cause damage out of the desire to do good, and since morality is entirely determined by intent, that means even some of the world's most destructive terrorists could still be considered good people. Obviously, that doesn't mean that they are still a problem we have to provide consequences for. It doesn't minimize the actual damage they caused, but it does have to slightly alter the way we understand these people. Some of those Muslim terrorists who blew themselves up could have been amazingly productive citizens if they had the chance to be raised in a non-extremist environment. They obviously demonstrate a willingness to self-sacrifice for what they believe is the greater good. I do have to clarify, though, that this doesn't apply to all of them because most believe that if they die then fighting, then God will then give them a bunch of virgins in their next life, and some are probably just extremely hate-filled people too. This graph also implies that people who are simply living life for themselves, who don't want to harm anyone, but also aren't seeking to do good, are probably not very morally good people, and likely even classify as slightly oriented toward evil because their lifestyles are mostly self-centered. So let's dig into the actual functions of this graph, starting with the x-axis called the morality axis. Whether or not your actions are morally positive is determined by the extent to which you have to sacrifice for the sake of others. and the extent to which your actions intentionally prioritize maximizing the cumulative well-being of everyone impacted by your actions, including yourself, or minimizing damage to well-being. Whether or not your actions are morally evil is determined by the extent to which you prioritize your own selfish desires at the expense of everyone's cumulative well-being. On the y-axis, we have the perceived value of your actions according to both yourself and everyone who knows of your actions. Humans mostly assign value to actions based on how they positively or negatively impact us. We might be skeptical of an obviously selfish person, but so long as they provide a high level of value to us, we'll probably keep them around. On the other hand, if your actions consistently result in consequences for others, they'll probably only care about how positive your intentions are for a very limited time frame. Before we get into the main sectors, let's take a look at the two unique sections I labeled near the center, starting with the job zone. This is not a perfect representation of the value and morality of every job on the planet, but I would say it's about 95% accurate. Before we get into the main sectors, let's take a look at the two unique sections I labeled near the center, starting with the job zone. This is not a perfect representation of the value and morality of every job on the planet, but I would say it's about 95% accurate. Notice most jobs fall into the middle, morally neutral or gray zone, and with a few exceptions, most jobs provide some amount of positive value to society. Most of us aren't taking pay cuts so that we can work overtime for a nonprofit, however. Our primary motivating factor when seeking a job revolves around the extent to which a job fulfills our wants and needs. Most of us are just doing what we need to provide for our families, which we chose to create, or we're pursuing some great ambition of our own. Because our motivations for job seeking are most directly self-centered, the actions we take while on the job tend to fall into this morally neutral area. They're not necessarily good or bad, but they do usually produce value. Let's talk about the ignorance zone. Ignorance is a word we all tend to have a very negative connotation for, but we're all ignorant of many things. The real problem with ignorance is the extent to which we assert it, spread it, and act on it. Notice that ignorance also operates primarily in the neutral zone, leaning toward the morally positive side, because ignorance is almost never intentionally malicious, except for maybe people who are financially invested in perpetuating ignorance like social media influencers. Ignorant people might be damaging, but they still usually act on their ignorance out of the desire to do good. I'm moving on to the main four sectors now of this graph, starting with probably the easiest to discuss, the top right sector. This is where we have actions and people who are both well-intended and produce positive results for society. Sacrificial heroes reach toward the farthest corner of this section because they have to most fully commit to denying their own desires to support the well-being of others. I use the example of Batman because he is a billionaire who is wealthy enough to live his life pursuing anything he wants, but instead he commits to fighting injustice at great expense to his own safety, while sustaining a principled respect for even the lives of the criminals he captures. Enduring leadership is more important than temporary leadership because enduring leadership requires greater sacrifice. An example of enduring leadership would be someone who continuously leads a volunteer organization without pay or at a significant pay cut in comparison to what most people would expect to receive for fulfilling similar responsibilities. Temporary leaders are only fully committed for a limited time and may return to their everyday lives quickly after their leadership events are over. Examples include people who occasionally coach children's sports or lead short-term fundraising activities. Everyday kindness is the least significant to this sector because it typically doesn't require much sacrifice in terms of time, resources, or effort. The bottom right sector represents those with good intentions, such as unfortunate people or honorable fools, who fail to achieve positive results due to either unfortunate circumstances, ignorance, or unintelligence. This sector was actually the most difficult of all the sectors for me to map out because the labels applied to the diagonal arrow actually have a wide range of capacity to harm society. Generally, I think issues of poor communication typically result in more easily resolved problems than damage caused by radicalized individuals. I placed radicals between poor communicators and defeated do-gooders because radicalized people often have a mix of admirable and evil reasons for acting on their ignorance, so they're rarely completely innocent. On the bottom end of the sector, we have defeated do-gooders, which would represent people who are doing their best to protect and improve society but ultimately fail to overcome the odds against them. Examples of defeated do-gooders include people fighting for effective government policy change and military members who failed to achieve the political goals of their efforts, and you can see the picture example of the Vietnam War I included in the sector. Do not read too far into this example. I know lots of people have various opinions on whether Vietnam was an admirable war. I'm simply talking about the concept of people with boots on ground fighting for something that they perceive to be honorable. The bottom left sector is probably the easiest to explain. We usually know bad when we see it, and humans are very sensitive to negative outcomes. The labels along the diagonal line in this sector are distinguished by the extent to which we intentionally pursue our selfish and malicious desires at the expense of others. We can all think of a few historically nasty figures that belong at the far end of this quadrant. The only concept I think people may struggle to understand in this sector is the issue of people living with indifference or disinterested selfishness in relation to the well-being of others. I use the cat label for these people because they are usually just lazy and never really have much impact on anyone's life unless you try to force them into positions of responsibility. They may view themselves as good people, but they probably consistently make the lives of others slightly more difficult than necessary. The top left sector was probably the second most difficult for me to develop. Humans are selfish creatures, so many of our actions tend to drift into this quadrant. The categories of people who most frequently fall into this sector are typically smart negotiators, useful deceivers, and people who are just plain lucky that their actions turned out positive when they were probably trying to do something they shouldn't have done. The lucky people are often people who are just trying to do the job the easy way without integrity, and they're fortunate that everything works out in the end and no one catches their mistakes. Above the lucky people on the diagonal line are people who tend to be increasingly motivated and competent, but also increasingly selfish and power-hungry. You might know coworkers who do a very good job when they know they have a chance to promote themselves. Most businesses have to form relationships that are mutually beneficial, but also mutually focused on selfishly maximizing their own slice of the financial pie. And of course, at the furthest end of this sector, we have the power-hungry politicians and billionaires, obsessed with their own limelight, who may do just enough for us to look the other way when they show their corruption. Let's talk about the color gradient of the chart that represents our judgment of people and their actions. The problem I have with this component of our behavior is that we place far too much value on whether or not a person's actions produce positive value instead of their intentions. The reason why this is an absolutely massive problem is because judging people this way also allows useful psychopaths and narcissists to infiltrate society. This is possibly the real root of society's problems altogether, because we promote people based on their demonstrated ability to get things done without serious considerations for their character. I will argue that if we focused exclusively on promoting and protecting people in both of the right quadrants, even the fools, our society would be perfectly fine. Even the well-intended imbeciles near the bottom right would end up having almost no negative impact on society because their actions would be constantly guided by other good-natured people. The biggest reason why honorable fools are so damaging to society is because they are usually led by assholes in the left two quadrants. It doesn't matter how competent or motivated any selfish asshole might be. I promise you that over time they will find a way to steadily dissolve the value they bring to your lives and organizations. They will be constantly on the lookout for opportunities to siphon resources from your organization. As soon as they perceive that they've received as much from you as they can hope for, they will start packing to leave, and they won't prepare you for their departure unless they think they have something to lose. I have one final and most important implication we should all draw from this graph if we agree with it. That implication is that morals function entirely within the utilitarian moral system. Notice there are 0 actual rules along the X morality axis. The morality axis is exclusively focused on whether or not you are intentionally seeking to bring about positive impact for everyone affected by your actions. So if you agree with this chart, congratulations, you are now a moral utilitarian. If you're now concerned that this graph violates religious moral laws, don't worry, this graph is perfectly compatible with several religions like Christianity, and I actually have another video on this topic. Basically, a god, such as the one of the Bible, can be a moral utilitarian while still issuing strict moral laws simply because he knows we aren't always competent or knowledgeable enough to make good decisions on our own without a framework. I spent a lot of time developing this, so if you appreciated this video, like, subscribe, and provide any comments you have on the topic as well.